I just wanted to catalog some of my thoughts on the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. This is a big historical event, and I want to keep intact, I guess, how I feel in the moment, just a day after her passing, or just around 12 hours after her passing. Growing up, I didn't really have any connection with the Queen because I come from a country that is not part of the broader Commonwealth, and all I knew about the Queen, my first introduction to really thinking about the Queen was already at the beginning in opposition to the Queen, because I discovered when I was maybe 13 or 14 the genre of punk rock music, and that was my entry point to learning a little bit more about this idea of monarchy from the perspective originally of anti-monarchy, which I have to admit has shaped my views on things and this topic in general. I never really quite understood the purpose of why there are kings and queens in the 21st century. I never really thought too much about kings and queens because I come from a country that does not have any similar figure as such. I remember a few years ago, I was very surprised when I was visiting Bangkok, and I saw a lot of people all wearing black in mourning outside this palace that apparently was where the king, I guess the place where the king was being commemorated, because their king had recently passed away as well, Rama IX, or I think King Bhumibol, who at that time of his passing was the longest reigning monarch apart from King Louis XIV. And so now Bhumibol is the third, I guess, after Queen Elizabeth, who I think is I think 100 days longer, around 100 days longer than Rama IX, like her reign, I mean. And so growing up, I didn't really think so much about it, but I remember when I was in Thailand being so shocked at all of these people crying about someone who had passed away, I think, a year or two prior. Just a lot of people all wearing black, and I thought, well, that's so strange because here where I'm from, which is not too far away from Thailand, I don't think anyone would mourn as much over a certain figurehead as they were for him. As the years have passed, I've learned a bit more about why exactly they had so much reverence for him. At least from the perspective of the people who do care for him, and some of the people who didn't really care for him as much. He reigned for around 70 years as well, and he represented, for many people, the sense of continuity of Thai identity in a way that maybe, as I've been reading online, somewhat how they're describing Queen Elizabeth as well, where things go up and down in British society over the past 70 years, but the kind of one thing that the through line of everything was the presence of the Queen, and in a similar way to the King of Thailand was thought of as this person who, while they may not have like extreme kind of, and not even that much control over society and politics, they represented continuity. They represented like, well, we've gone through a lot of issues in the past, but we have this someone there who we know we can trust to guide us through whatever is going on. Someone who has seen history and has wisdom perhaps, or who can kind of give a guiding hand. The difference between Rama IX and Queen Elizabeth, of course, is that her reach was global. She is the head of state of several countries around the world. I was surprised to see the number of countries in which she was head of state in. And British monarchy is very closely tied to the idea of imperialism and colonialism, and the reason why there are so many Commonwealth countries was because the British were colonizing so much of the world, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, leading into the 20th century, where a lot of those formal colonizations were dissolved, or at least in practice dissolved, but they kept the monarchy as the head of state. The face of the Queen is on many bills from all over the world, even though they don't necessarily have a lot of, it's not like they're like with the Queen says something they would follow it or something, but they have the Queen in their bills. The Queen represents the sense of maybe a greater past or a greater family of tradition that binds together the Commonwealth nation of the world. And for me, I feel like, so that's a big difference, right? For King Bhumibol, he was the king of Thailand, or king of Siam, or whatever you want to call it, and pretty much that was his kind of main territory. But Queen Elizabeth has broader reach. Her face was on bills everywhere. So her death is inevitably going to affect her her kind of image around in a lot of countries around the world, just because of how prominent her image is. Her, the transition of imagery from Queen Elizabeth to King, I don't even remember his name. That's how disconnected I am from British politics. But her eldest son, who I think was the one who married Princess Diana, I think, it might have been Charles. But that kind of transition of imagery, the transition of who one takes as representative of this greatness, is now passed on to someone who may not have commanded this, who may never really command the same amount of respect or prominence in society as their parent. In a similar way, in Thailand right now, there was a lot of controversy because a mixture of the feelings of sadness towards passing of their king was also tied into this disappointment about who the follow-up would be. King Rama X was embroiled with a lot of controversy while he was growing up, in a similar way that King Charles was. And so this idea of transitioning of a figurehead to another is going to be an interesting process to see around the world, where the queen's image on built, will they replace it with a king? Will there even be enough of a desire from the society to put the picture of her son on their bills? Will he continue to be representative of the greatness of this collective shared past of the Commonwealth that they at least think of themselves as being a part of, all over the world, from the Caribbean to Africa to, here in Australia and New Zealand, all of these places, Canada? Like, to what extent will the transition of imagery really be able to, actually transition? Because in my kind of how I see things, in Thailand it was a different situation because it was very insulated inside the country. But with this global reach of the image of the queen and just the prominence of that, I feel like there will be more of a discussion on whether or not that idea of maintaining the imagery of the kind of the British monarchy in general around the world will be necessary or even be desired by the countries that have been doing it since the lifespan of the queen. And so I feel like there is most likely going to be not more than one or several movements towards a disconnection with the British monarchy, especially in terms of imagery and symbolism. And within the countries in which that is going to be a bigger issue, I feel like they're going to have interesting discussions, I guess, about what, for the countries that may lean towards perhaps moving away from having the British monarchy be representative of their head of state, or to have the image of the British monarchy, which, for many of these countries, also played a big part in their history, mostly in negative ways, especially through the slave trade, for example. In Malaysia, and so it's going to be interesting to see how that transitions into perhaps more republicanism or more secular, or like kind of moving away from this adherence to royalty. Those discussions will be interesting, and I feel like the only result of this in terms of the image of the British monarchy will be a weakening of the monarchy globally, is for sure. And I'm sure within the UK, after a few more weeks have passed, months have passed, more discussions will be had about the utility of having the British monarchy, especially if that transition of respect and reverence cannot be perfectly kind of moved on to her son. And so what is the place of the monarchy in the 21st century? Do we need to have kings and queens that pass on their bloodlines and are thought of as representative of this idea of a nation that often, was never really a nation, but a combination of little different, culturally distinct places and races that, because of the expansion of the empire, ended up becoming subsumed into this idea of the nation. And then that whole kind of constructed idea gets represented by a figurehead that is, it's pretty antiquated, I think, in this day and age. And so I'm quite curious to see how those discussions will play out within the UK and how it will reverberate around the world, especially in terms of how monarchy is still a thing in many countries around the world. The Netherlands has monarchy, and so it's just all over the world. And so I feel like these discussions will be very interesting. It'll be interesting to see how this will progress from here, and whether or not the idea of the monarchy will survive the next decade or so.